Hello, today I'm taking a look at another New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And sorry, this may be becoming a bit repetitive, but I thought it would be a good idea. The wines I've looked at so far have been a little older. This is from the 2025 vintage, and this is Oyster Bay from Marlborough. So a classic New Zealand brand, widely available in export markets. Oyster Bay is owned by a long-established winery owned by a Croatian family, Delegats. So Nicola Delegat first came to New Zealand in 1938, the same year as the person who was to become his wife. Her name was Vidavosa. They both came to West Auckland, where there was a thriving Croatian community. They met, and in 1941 they married. Although Nicola's family had been making wine back in Croatia for centuries, they didn't immediately go into wine production. In fact, the couple moved to the Waikato and were involved in dairy farming for nearly 7 years, until they'd saved up enough money to buy a 4-acre plot near Henderson in West Auckland, where they could settle down, plant a vineyard and build a winery. While winemaking was part of Nicola's heritage, they had to work hard to be established. They were selling wine from the cellar door, but then they also started selling via mail order to the friends that they'd made while they were dairy farming in the Waikato area. Now, it was in 1973 that Nicola passed away, leaving his wife Vidavosa as a widow. Now, their two eldest daughters had already settled down, started families and had their own businesses. So it was left to their two youngest children, Jim and Rosemary, or Rose as she's known, who were both in their early 20s, to take over the company and drive it forward. And Jim and Rose both recognised and exploited a growing appetite for wine in New Zealand, in an industry that was rapidly changing to follow an increasing demand for table wines. And in their first moves by 1978, the two siblings had established vineyards further south in the east coast region of Hawke's Bay. And this major investment underpinned their ability to make quality wines. By this stage, in the early 80s, Chardonnay was driving demand. So they specifically imported a particular clone of Chardonnay, UC Davis, University of Davis's Clone 6. And this became an important clone for them, again, underpinning the quality of their Chardonnays. I suppose the third step on the way to improving the quality of their wines was to start importing French oak barriques. So new French oak barrels in which to ferment their wines. And they started doing this in 1983. They went on in 1996 to purchase further vineyards in Hawke's Bay. Those were on Gimblett Road. So they were some of the early exponents of the Gimblett Gravels terroir that are so famous these days. So all these various steps were designed to drive improvements in the quality of Delegats wines. And today, Delegats are a company that owns somewhere in the region of 4,000 hectares of vineyard throughout New Zealand. But it's their next big project that relates to this, because that was the foundation of the Oyster Bay Brand, which saw them start planting vineyards in Marlborough in 1988. The first vintage of Sauvignon Blanc that they produced from Marlborough was the 1990 vintage. And the following year, 1991, saw it win the coveted Marquis de Goulaine Trophy in the International Wine and Spirit Competition. So an incredible start for any wine brand to win such a prestigious international trophy from a well-known competition with its first vintage. And the success, particularly of Oyster Bay, Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, has driven the brand onwards, and today it's one of New Zealand's leading brands. The Oyster Bay brand was very much designed to sort of showcase the potential quality of New Zealand's wines. It's named with the idea of embodying New Zealand's clean green image. Its packaging is quite distinctive, it stands out, it's modern and it's easily identifiable. To be fair, the brand name Oyster Bay doesn't really relate to any geographic feature or place. In fact, different varieties in the brand are sourced not only from Marlborough, but also from Hawke's Bay. Thus, specifically, although it has a New Zealand identity, it's not a brand that's tied to any particular region. Now, in 2005, there actually was some quite administrative upheaval as far as Oyster Bay is concerned, because although Delegats had worked to build the brand, they had other shareholders. And one of the minority shareholders, somebody called Peter Yealand, who held shares in Oyster Bay through an investment company that he owned, launched a protracted and eventually unsuccessful takeover bid for the brand. And the succession of bid and counter bid that went on resulted in a lengthy legal and regulatory dispute that lasted until 2010, when the two parties reached a settlement and Delegats were able to buy out Peter Yealand's stake in the Oyster Bay Brand. So to talk about the wine, first of all, it's a wine that's very typical of the Marlborough region. So just to locate that, we're at the top of New Zealand's South Island. It's a place with a dry, sunny, but temperate climate, giving the grapes a long, slow ripening period that spans from January through to April. There are clear, cold nights that keep acid levels high and preserve delicate aromas, even when the sugar levels are rising rapidly. So this day-night temperature fluctuation is crucial to preserving acidities and retaining the fruit's delicate aromatic nature. Vineyards from which grapes for this wine are taken are listed as being in the Wairau Valley and the Awatere Valley. Then the details I'm given about soil types really talk principally about the Wairau Valley, Renwick and Brancott. Here they're talking about shallow, sandy loams over deep layers of free-draining river gravel, providing moderate fertility and giving excellent drainage. As far as clones are concerned, I don't often see people talking about the clones for Sauvignon Blanc in quite the same way as they do for Chardonnay, but here they emphasise the fact that they're using Bordeaux clones and UC Davis Clone 1, with the idea of making sure that they're giving the instantly recognisable varietal intensity of Sauvignon Blanc. They say they use medium to low vigour rootstocks, and that these are matched specifically to the clone and to the specific soil type that it's growing in. Oyster Bay were founder members of Sustainable Wine Growing New Zealand, the initiative for sustainability that is pretty much universal amongst New Zealand's wineries. They're environmentally conscious, and this has led them to identify areas such as wetlands, streams and areas of native vegetation, and to ensure that none of their actions are affecting the plants or animals that inhabit these locations. They talk about minimising water usage by employing a system of state-of-the-art soil moisture probes. They use inter-row ground cover plantings and spread natural mulches beneath the vines that encourages biodiversity and attracts beneficial insects into the vineyard. Vine age is noted as being between 5 and 27 years. So some of those vines are going back to those original 1988 plantings. Now 2025 was a really lovely vintage. It was a long dry vintage in Marlborough and delivered excellent conditions for ripening the fruit. Warm weather early on accelerated growth before cooling in March allowed them to preserve the aromas and the acidities in the fruit. There were generous yields and quality overall was exceptional, and this is seen as a standout vintage for Marlborough. So as far as the winemaking is concerned, we have harvest dates between the 10th of March and the 10th of April. Now, presumably more or less all the fruit was machine picked for a wine at this price. I think that's necessary, but throughout harvest the different plots to be harvested were being selected according to their ripeness. There was selection from progressively ripening plots, generally commencing with the coastal vineyards and working inland. Now on arrival at the winery, the fruit was destemmed and it went into tank presses, sort of pneumatic tank presses, and the free run juice that resulted was separated from that which resulted from pressing. The juice was clarified and was then inoculated with selected yeast, and a range of yeasts was used to create a number of different characteristics. All the fermentations went on in stainless steel tanks, and these were long, slow fermentations designed to capture the aromas of the fruit rather than let them bubble off. So temperatures were kept down to between 12 and 14 degrees Celsius, which is pretty cool for fermentation. After fermentation, the wine stayed in tank for a short period with its lees. The wine was then bottled young to preserve its freshness. So let's see what we make of it, shall we? I'll say the wine is very pale. It's water white to sort of pale greenish, although I do have to say that I'm looking at it with green trees behind it, but I think there is still a slight greenish hint there. Swelling it, the wine has 12% alcohol, so not too high. There does seem to be a very slight amount of CO2 coming off as I swirl that, which is not unusual for young wine. I don't think that means it will be sparkling. It's simply just that there's been a little bit of CO2 captured, possibly at bottling. It's not particularly forming. It is just starting to form some tears there. So I'm not expecting this to be a heavyweight wine. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? I have to say, I've been standing with the glass here, and the aromas have been quite pungent and noticeable while I've been talking to you. Swirling it is giving off some quite high-toned, quite greenish, sort of grassy, nettly notes. There are also notes of gooseberry and some quite vivid, pungent notes of passion fruit coming through there in the aromas. So it's predominantly at the greener end of the spectrum, with that little bit of tropical fruit, the passion fruit, sort of coming through towards at the end there. So let's have a taste. Gosh, the wine is dry. Now, the technical notes actually say this has got 4 grams per litre of residual sugar left in it, just to balance some of the sharpness in there. And there really is quite a sharp, quite tart, greenish acidity sitting there. Gives the wine a very mouth-watering nature. The wine's quite light-bodied, but actually possibly it's that little tiny amount of sugar, but also perhaps the richness of the passion fruit flavours in there are balancing that tartness and stopping that from seeming objectionable. Actually, the acidity ends up seeming sort of quite clean, lean, linear and mineral. As I say, the wine's light-bodied, but there's a pungency to the fruit. And I think that is perhaps the key to the 2025 vintage from Marlborough, that it's got this lifted acidity that's supporting some really clean aromatics and giving wines that are light, delicate, but actually have sort of a good length of flavour because of the acidity there. And there is quite a lovely, initially citric, but then again, those sort of passion fruit notes coming back again, acidity on the finish, where it's quite mouth-watering, and the fruit flavours are lasting reasonably well. I was interested to see that this wine, which is not a particularly expensive wine, had an aggregated critic score on Wine Searcher of 90 out of 100. And I did wonder if that was as a result of the fact there was just a single score there, and maybe that scorer had been slightly generous. But actually, I don't think 90 is a particularly over-the-top score for this. It's a simple and relatively light wine, but it has that incredible purity of acidity, intense aromas, and those aromas give a lovely, focused purity to the fruit that's there. Alcohol is balanced. There's enough fruit to balance the very racy acidity. I certainly wouldn't suggest this is a wine for aging. I would think it best to drink this over the next 2 years. But certainly it's a wine whose attractive immediacy really does make it well worth drinking now, such as its purity and its vibrancy. So thank you so much for joining me to watch this tasting. I will leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see if it's available in your market and at what price. If you've enjoyed the tasting, do please consider pressing the like button. That would be very much appreciated. Also, if you've been watching these tastings and you enjoy them, it would be fantastic if you'd consider subscribing. That's a great support to me in trying to develop the channel further. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. And if you have any comments, please do pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. So thank you very much for joining me. And I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time in the near future and come and join me and watch another video tasting. Until then, bye for now.